Hi, this is Christian Takushi, your independent macroeconomist and geopolitical strategist, coming to you with the latest from the world of geopolitics and macroeconomics. Inflation in 2023. Why should you care? I believe you should care about the current inflation problem because inflation is like an income tax. It affects everyone. It's like an income tax affecting everyone, especially unfair on those of you that live responsibly and do save some money. Inflation benefits people that are living beyond their means, they are over indebted, and they like to live on debt. Basically, the US government and most G7 economies or G7 governments would be benefiting from inflation. And because of this situation, our governments have a big incentive now to let inflation run. That's why I believe everyone should be keeping an eye on inflation. The other reason why I want to bring an update on inflation is because at the beginning of this year, we are seeing quite a lot of forecasts concerning inflation. And many of those forecasts I find are quite a bit extreme. There are quite a few experts saying inflation is running out of control, and the Fed has and the ECB have lost the battle, the fight against inflation. Things are going to get very, very bad. And one reason is to fight inflation of 7%, you have to have your policy rates at least at 7%. That's correct. And the Fed should have interest rates at least at 8% or 8.5% if it's really serious about fighting inflation. So, because of the massive debt in the US and the US government, the Fed will never do it. So, the inflation is going to get out of control. That's what many experts are saying. On the other hand, we see also another extreme on the of forecasts. A lot of experts saying that the inflation problem is actually behind us, and the peak is behind us clearly, and therefore the Fed is going to pivot very soon, meaning lower interest rates. That's going to bless the economy, and people should be going back to buying risk assets. Very often, these experts are also, their companies are selling risk products or equity funds. So we have to be careful with what people say because their views may be biased by the potential conflict of interest, right? Um, so there are people that want to sell maybe some hedge funds or some equity products, and depending on what they're selling, they have a certain bias in their views. Okay, I personally think that there is a very elevated number of views out there on inflation at the beginning of this year that are a bit extreme or even flawed. So people need to pay attention. Among the flow views, yeah, I see a lot of commentators and even financial experts talking about inflation coming down in 23. As an example, I heard someone saying inflation is going to be 5%. That is half the inflation we had in the year before. So that's going to restore purchasing power and the mood of consumers. So he said it's a great gain to consumers. That's going to drive consumers to purchase more. It's like a restoration of their purchasing power. That is not. And I think many people in the financial industry do not understand inflation. They look at 5% inflation as being a benefit for investors. Sure, for investors, yes, but not for consumers. And the reason is inflation accumulates. If inflation is 5% this year, together with the inflation that we had last year, let's say 10%, we would have an inflation over 2 years of roughly 15%. And that means that the purchasing power for most consumers, for consumers this year, would deteriorate again. So last year, people lost purchasing power in the range of 10%. This year, they lose another 5%. That is not good news. That is not good news. Maybe less bad news, but not necessarily good news. The point is this: when people in the financial industry talk to you about inflation, you have to understand that what really benefits you doesn't benefit them. What consumers need in 2023 is a deflation of 5% or even 10% in order to recover their purchasing power that they lost last year. But a deflation of 5% or 10% would spook financial markets. It would be very bad for financial markets. So, what do financial markets need? They need moderate inflation. So, for financial markets, a continued deterioration of your purchasing power is a blessing. This is why they get so excited about inflation being 5%, which again is just showing to you that you have to be careful with what you hear and who says that to you, because what is great for the financial markets may not be so good for you. There is actually now um, a time. Now it's time to say to you what I expect for this year. For this year in 2023, I think it is particularly difficult to make forecasts for many reasons, and those of you who read my newsletters know why I'm cautious in the year this year with forecasts. And the main reason is massive amount of government intervention, especially in our Western economies. But if I have to make a forecast, it would be the following. I think inflation in 2023 is going to moderate. Barring any new surprises or new shocks to the economy, inflation should come down to maybe 5 or 6%. That is what I expect for this year. And that is actually not so bad for the Fed. Why? Because and I think this is where quite a few people get it wrong with inflation. Those who think that inflation has already gotten out of control, they get wrong because they see inflation currently at 8 or 9%, and they expect the Fed to raise interest rate to 8 or 9% to fight inflation. And that's not the case. Central bank economists decompose inflation. They look at the different components that are driving inflation, and they know that there is quite a bit of inflation that they cannot control, that is just war related to the war in Ukraine or related to the sanctions of the West against Russia. That inflation cannot be controlled or addressed by the Fed. The Fed will focus on the natural economic inflation, and that is, in my opinion, only is going to come down to 5 or 6% this year. So that inflation that is not related to the war in Ukraine and to the Western sanctions, our sanctions against Russia, that inflation that will remain, that is left, is probably 5 to 6%, or coming down towards 5 and 6%. And can the Fed raise policy rates to the level of 5 or 6%? Yes, it can. Actually, it's not that far away from it anymore. So this is where I have a slightly more positive view for the Fed getting the inflation under control in this year. The problem that I see for inflation is actually more medium term. Medium term, I'm cautious with inflation because our Western governments have a huge incentive in keeping inflation elevated. At what level? I would say anything between 5 and 7% would be very beneficial for our Western governments, because that would mean the inflation is not getting out of control or runaway inflation, but it would be an elevated inflation that would reduce the real burden of the debt. Inflation blesses the debtors. It reduces the real weight or the real burden of that debt on the debtor. And that is why it is like a wealth transfer. Inflation, elevated inflation over many years, is a wealth transfer from the people that live responsibly, that save money, to those that live out of debt, on debt, and have accumulated already a lot of debt. This is the case, I believe, for Western economies in the coming years or for the rest of this decade, that we have Western governments with a big incentive to pop up inflation and keep inflation elevated. What would benefit them the most? I think inflation staying around 4 to 7% would benefit them a lot. And if I would have to zero in on a target, probably 5%. This is actually very likely because we have a situation where our Western economies, developed economies, have a huge amount of debt. They are highly indebted. Our democracies in the West are very dysfunctional, as you all know. We have a lot of political polarization in the West, and with such dysfunctional democratic systems and political systems, The rise in importance of social media and the desire of our politicians to be popular in social media means they're going to enact very popular measures, and all the solutions for our current problems imply short-term pain. And I don't think that we have any politician in the West that would like to do that, to inflict short-term pain during his term. Actually, is the opposite. They're trying to do popular things to become popular, to help their parties, and to boost their social media popularity. This convergence of trends is just simply negative for inflation, the inflation outlook that I have for the rest of this decade. Nevertheless, this is something that we need to watch because there are always new surprises and shocks to the system. So even this outlook on inflation has to be actually looked at again. I would like to thank you for having been with us on this update on inflation. This is Christian Takushi, your independent macroeconomist and geopolitical strategist.